Since the dawn of human civilization, we have been taught that power belongs to the side with the largest armies, the heaviest shields, or the most gold. We look at history books and see maps drawn in blood, empires built on iron, and modern nations secured by nuclear arsenals. But the history books lied to you. True power has never belonged to the strongest. It belongs to the master of the illusion. Throughout human history, the most devastating traps were never sprung on open battlefields. They were engineered inside the minds of kings, presidents, generals, and CEOs. A perfectly placed whisper, a calculated bluff, or a multi-billion-dollar deception has done more to collapse empires and elevate superpowers than any weapon ever forged. If you know where to look, you realize that the world we live in today, the borders we respect, the money we spend, and the militaries we fear was not built by accident. It was sculpted by a series of grand deceptions. To understand how deep the rabbit hole goes, we have to strip away the modern world entirely. We must travel back to the very beginning, to a time before the United States existed, before Europe had kings, before the word country was ever spoken. We must travel back over 4,000 years to the birthplace of human greed and the setting of the world's very first documented conspiracy. The year is roughly 2700 before the Common Era. We are in ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. For thousands of years, humans lived as wandering tribes, hunting what they could find and moving with the seasons. But here, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, everything changed. Humans learned to control water. They built irrigation systems, harvested surplus crops, and built the world's very first true civilization. Sumer. With surplus food came cities. With cities came specialized labor. And with specialized labor came the invention of something humanity had never dealt with before: massive, concentrated wealth. For the first time, human beings had things worth stealing. Sumer was not a single country. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states like Uruk, Uar, and Kish. They shared the same language and gods, but they vied constantly for dominance. To the east, across the jagged Zagros Mountains, lay another rising power, the land of Elam, centered in modern-day Iran. For decades, Sumer and Elam traded peacefully. They exchanged textiles and grain for timber, precious stones, and metals. But peace is a fragile thing when one side realizes that violence is far more profitable than commerce. Enter King Enmebarjizi of Kish. History remembers him as the first ruler whose name was actually carved into stone, making him the oldest verified historical figure in human existence. But he was also the architect of a dark turning point in human behavior. Enmebarjizi looked at the massive wealth his city-state was generating, and then he looked at the resources locked away in the mountains of Elam. He realized a terrifying truth. Trading required giving something up. But a military conquest? A conquest meant you could take everything, keep your own goods, and reduce your neighbors to slaves. But you cannot just tell your people to march across a mountain range to murder strangers for profit. You have to convince them. You have to create a narrative. Using the world's first recorded campaign of state propaganda, the king of Kish convinced his people that the Elamites were a direct threat to their gods, their families, and their survival. He framed an offensive invasion as a holy act of defense. The illusion worked. For the first time in human history, thousands of men laid down their farming tools, picked up mass-produced bronze weapons, and formed an organized marching army. The destination was Elam. The goal was total annihilation. When the forces of Sumer poured over the Zagros Mountains, the Elamites were completely unprepared for the sheer scale of organized warfare. This wasn't a tribal skirmish over hunting grounds. This was an industrial slaughter. The Sumerians moved in tight formations, using heavy bronze-tipped spears and solid wooden battle wagons drawn by wild donkeys. The ancient clay tablets record the result with chilling brevity. Enmebarjizi despoiled the land of Elam. The Sumerians completely crushed the Elamite forces. They looted their temples, stripped their cities of gold and timber, and dragged thousands of survivors back to Kish in chains. This conflict, occurring over 4,700 years ago, stands as the world's very first officially recorded war. But the physical horror of this shift in human nature was discovered by modern archaeologists even deeper in the dirt. At a site known as Cemetery 117, located near the Nile River, scientists uncovered the bones of an even older conflict dating back 12,000 years. Over half of the skeletons, men, women, and children alike, bore the unmistakable marks of deep violence. Chipped flint arrowheads and spear points were still embedded deep within their bones. Whether written in the clay of Iraq or buried in the sands of Sudan, the lesson was clear. Humanity had discovered that the ultimate shortcut to supreme power was organized violence masked by a convincing lie. Sumer won the first war, establishing a brutal template of empire that would be copied for millennia. But as the centuries rolled on, empires grew larger, smarter, and more subtle. Thousands of years later, a young nation born across the Atlantic Ocean would realize a profound truth. You don't need to march armies across mountains to conquer the world. You just need to control the paper everyone uses to buy their weapons. To understand how a nation becomes an undisputed global superpower, you have to look past its military parades and look at its geography. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States won what historians call the geographic lottery. Look at the map. The United States is bordered by two massive oceans, the Atlantic to the east and the Pacific to the west. This provided an impenetrable, thousands of miles wide buffer zone against the hyper-militarized powers of Europe and Asia. While foreign empires spent centuries constantly building massive border forts and panicking over invasions from neighboring rivals, America was left completely alone to build its infrastructure, cultivate its massive agricultural valleys, and extract unimaginable reserves of oil, coal, and iron. By the time the 20th century arrived, America had quietly transformed into an industrial titan. It possessed the largest manufacturing capacity on Earth. Yet, it remained a secondary player in global politics, overshadowed by the massive global empires of Great Britain and France. But then, the old world tore itself apart. Between 1939 and 1945, World War II devastated the planet. The traditional superpowers of the world, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, saw their cities leveled, their factories bombed into ash, and their entire generations wiped out. Their economies were completely bankrupt. But look across the ocean at the United States. Because of its geographic isolation, not a single factory on the American mainland had been bombed. Its infrastructure was entirely intact, its workforce was thriving, and its production lines were running day and night. By 1945, the U.S. produced half of the entire world's manufactured goods and held a staggering 80% of the world's gold reserves. The rest of the world was broken, bleeding, and entirely broke. They desperately needed money to rebuild. And America was holding all the chips. In July 1944, while the war was still raging, 730 financial masterminds from 44 nations walked into the luxurious Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The purpose of this secret gathering was simple: rebuild the collapsed global financial system so the world wouldn't fall into another Great Depression. The European nations, led by brilliant economists like Britain's John Maynard Keynes, wanted to create a neutral global currency, a shared system where no single country held the upper hand. But America had other plans. Represented by a shrewd Treasury official named Harry Dexter White, the United States leveraged its massive wealth. America told the desperate nations a simple proposition: we will back the global economy. Instead of creating a new currency, we will link the US dollar directly to our massive gold reserves. Then, every other country will link their currency directly to the US dollar. Because the world desperately needed American loans, food, and machinery to survive, they had no choice. They signed the paper. This was the ultimate silent hustle. With a single stroke of a pen, the US dollar became the undisputed global reserve currency. If a country wanted to buy oil from the Middle East, trade coffee from South America, or purchase steel from Europe, they had to exchange their own currency for US dollars first. Decades later, when the US officially took the dollar off the gold standard, the trap was already locked. The world couldn't leave. The global economy ran entirely on American paper. The United States had achieved absolute global dominance not just by winning a war, but by controlling the financial air the rest of the planet breathed. For decades, this financial leverage secured American power. But global dominance breeds bitter rivals. By the height of the Cold War in the 1970s, a massive ideological enemy rose in the East, the Soviet Union, and they were preparing to challenge American supremacy using a terrifying weapon that would spark the most expensive game of psychological poker in human history. The year is 1970. The Cold War is at a knife edge. In the dark rooms of the Pentagon, CIA analysts are staring intently at high-altitude spy satellite photographs. Something massive was moving inside the Soviet Union's classified aviation hangars. It was an aircraft unlike anything the West had ever seen. It possessed giant wings, 2 colossal engine exhausts, and a sleek, menacing frame. Then came the radar logs. Over the skies of the Middle East, Western military radar picked up a ghost. A Soviet pilot had pushed this mystery aircraft to an impossible speed, Mach 3.2. That is over 2,400 miles per hour. It was flying so fast and so high that Western surface-to-air missiles couldn't touch it, and no Allied fighter jet could even catch up to look at it. The Pentagon completely panicked. Based entirely on its massive wing size and incredible speed, Western military intelligence drew a terrifying conclusion. The Soviets had built the ultimate superfighter. They assumed the giant wings meant the jet was highly agile, capable of outmaneuvering any American plane while carrying a massive payload of deadly missiles. If war broke out tomorrow, this single aircraft could completely wipe out NATO's air force and give the Soviet Union absolute control of the skies. The jet was designated by NATO as the MiG-25, the Foxbat. Fearing they had completely lost the technological arms race, the United States government launched an emergency multi-billion-dollar counterprogram. The entire design of America's next-generation fighter jet, the F-15 Eagle, was completely overhauled and rewritten for one single purpose: to defeat the terrifying MiG-25. The U.S. spent an estimated $10 billion in research, development, and manufacturing. They utilized advanced, ultra-expensive titanium skins, complex onboard computers, and highly advanced aerodynamics just to match the perceived threat of the Soviet ghost jet. For 6 long years, the entire Western world lived in absolute terror of the Foxbat. The Soviet Union played along perfectly, keeping the aircraft shrouded in total secrecy, letting the American military-industrial complex bleed cash out of pure paranoia. But a lie can only survive as long as you keep the box locked. And on September 6, 1976, a desperate man decided to steal the key. September 6, 1976. Soviet Lieutenant Viktor Belenko climbed into the cockpit of his MiG-25 for a routine training mission. But Belenko was a man harboring a dangerous secret. He was deeply disillusioned with the oppressive Soviet regime. His personal life was collapsing, and he wanted out. He knew that the multi-billion-dollar aircraft he was piloting was his only ticket to freedom. Midway through the flight, Belenko suddenly broke formation. He slammed his stick forward, diving his massive jet down to a terrifyingly low altitude of just 100 feet above the ocean waves. By flying this low, he completely dropped off both Soviet and Japanese military radars. He pushed the throttles forward, racing across the stormy sea of Japan. He knew that if his own air force tracked him, they would launch a nuclear-tipped missile to vaporize him instantly to protect the jet's secrets. Belenko ran dangerously low on fuel. With his warning lights flashing red, he punched through the cloud cover over Hokkaido, Japan, and targeted the civilian runway at Hakodate Airport. The runway was far too short for a heavy military interceptor. The jet screamed across the tarmac, blowing out its tires and skidding hundreds of feet into the mud past the runway's edge. Belenko opened the canopy, stepped out of the cockpit, drew his service pistol, fired 2 warning shots into the air to keep the shocked civilian onlookers back, and demanded political asylum in the United States. The Soviet government went into absolute hysteria. They demanded the immediate return of their aircraft, claiming the pilot had been kidnapped. But the Americans moved faster. Within hours, a team of elite intelligence officers and aerospace engineers rushed the MiG-25 to a secure, hidden military hangar. For the first time in history, the West was going to look inside the world's most terrifying superweapon. They began to unscrew the panels, strip the wiring, and dismantle the plane piece by piece. What they discovered left the engineers standing in absolute, stunned silence. The $10 billion threat was an absolute illusion. The Pentagon had spent years assuming the jet was constructed from advanced, lightweight titanium alloys. But when engineers touched the skin, they realized it was built entirely from heavy, cheap, hand-welded nickel steel. The plane was so incredibly heavy that the only way to get it off the ground was to bolt 2 monstrous, inefficient cruise missile engines to the back of it. But the surprises didn't stop there. When they opened the advanced radar and electronic systems, they didn't find sophisticated microchips or solid-state technology. They found outdated glass vacuum tubes, the kind used in old 1950s living room radios. The terrifying superfighter wasn't agile at all. Because of its extreme weight, if a pilot tried to turn sharply at high speeds, the structural steel would literally snap, ripping the plane apart in midair. Furthermore, that legendary Mach 3.2 speed, it was a complete fluke. Flying that fast completely melted the engines, turning them into useless junk after a single run. The MiG-25 wasn't a dogfighter designed to conquer the skies. It was just a giant, heavy-flying rocket designed to take off in a straight line, fire a missile at a high-altitude bomber, and land. The world's most terrifying weapon was a paper tiger. The Pentagon had spent billions fighting a ghost. After completely stripping the plane and copying every blueprint, the Japanese and American governments packed the completely disassembled pieces of the jet into 30 massive wooden crates. They loaded them onto a cargo ship, sent them back to the Soviet Union, and attached a very official bill for $40,000 to cover the shipping costs and the damage Belenko had caused to the civilian runway. The illusion was broken. The grand bluff was over. When those 30 crates arrived back in Moscow, the leaders of the Soviet Union realized their psychological spell had vanished. They had fooled the world for 6 years, but the truth had finally come out. Yet, history has a funny way of delivering the ultimate twist. By terrifying the United States into spending billions to counter a fake threat, the U.S. had inadvertently built the F-15 Eagle, an aircraft that actually did become the most flawless, dominant, and lethal fighter jet in human history, maintaining a perfect 1:0 kill ratio in combat. The illusion of a Soviet weapon forced the creation of a real American superpower. From the bloody mud city-states of ancient Sumer to the high-stakes financial tables of New Hampshire, all the way to the secret airspaces of the Cold War, human history proves one absolute, unchanging law: power built on a lie will always crumble the moment the world looks inside the box. A deception can manipulate armies, alter global economies, and terrify nations for a moment. The truth can be delayed, but it can never be destroyed. Would you have had the courage to steal that jet and fly it across an ocean for freedom? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this true story.